So some time ago, I offered if people would like to kind of do an expose on the virtues in the Christian life. I'd be happy to do so as just kind of a ready break from the discernment of spirits lessons. So this week I will put forth both just kind of the introduction to the life of virtues, as well as do rule number 8 for the discernment of spirits. So in order to first start out with these virtues, I think it's important to note that in the spiritual tradition, there are 3 major stages to the spiritual life. There is what's called the purgative, the illuminative, and the unitive. And so each one of these 3 categories, which has been used of quite a long time in our spiritual tradition, show what the soul is actually gaining in the spiritual life and how they're imploring spiritual or even physical realities. So just a very brief recap. The purgative is just like what you would think it would be, right? Purgatory, it's purifying. So it's moving away from attachments to sin and vice and moving towards virtue. The illuminative phase is that stage in the spiritual life where you start to get like aha moments, where you're like kind of going along with your spiritual life and things are just starting to click. There's not so much a desire to like seek out sin. It's more so like, oh, I'm just really hungry for spiritual things. That's usually a sign that you're in the illuminative. The unitive phase is probably for the soul and the person the most baffling of stages, because it means the soul is completely captivated by God, and the purification, the sanctification that's going on is oftentimes met with lots of paranormal things, miracles, visions, raptures, ecstasies, and the soul doesn't obtain them or achieve them. The soul is so conformed to God that miraculous things start to happen. Now, the reason why it's important to kind of get this groundwork or this kind of playing field is because the seeking after virtues typically happens in both the purgative and the illuminative. The purgative in that we're now moving away from vice, so then we have to move towards something else, which is virtue. If you look in the spiritual tradition, virtues are typically found within the illuminative phase. Because as the lights are starting to come on in the spiritual life, it's like, that's how I should be behaving. That's what I should be doing with my life. And so within like the whole spectrum of spirituality, the seeking after Christian virtues happens in the illuminative phase. Now, of course, you can obtain a virtue at any point in your spiritual life. But if you're trying to do some more research on it, that's actually where you'll start to find it. So personally, whenever I'm kind of imagining what virtues are like, I always think of them as like jewels being placed into jewelry. And the reason I love this imagery is actually, it comes from St. Paul. St. Paul speaks in his Colossians. He says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and beloved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bear with each other, and forgive one another as the Lord has forgiven you." This is Colossians 3:12, 13. And St. Paul actually talks a lot about putting off vice and putting on virtue. So if you can imagine, like, you're being clothed and adorned with all the virtues. One of the beautiful things in our tradition actually comes from the vision that St. Catherine Labouré had of the miraculous medal. And in this vision, she saw Our Lady on top of the altar with her hands extended like this, and she had rings on all of her fingers with jewels that some of them were illuminated, some were not. And when Catherine Labouré said, "Well, what is this?" Mary responded, "These are graces and gifts that I wish to give to the world. The ones that are illuminated are those graces and gifts that they've asked for. The ones that are not illuminated are gifts that I wish to bring, but no one has asked." And so this is what's really cool about kind of doing a study on the virtues, is it's saying, okay, I want to clothe myself and adorn myself with the holy things of God. Now, this imagery of jewels being virtues also actually works really well with how we obtain them. Just like a jewel. So here is my ring to remind me that I'm married to the church. And on it, there's no facets. So I couldn't put a jewel on this. If I wanted to, I'd have to like hot glue it in, and it would just fall off as soon as it got bumped. If you look at a beautiful ring that has a jewel on it, there's a facet that holds the jewel so it doesn't fall out. This is actually how we obtain virtues in our life. is we create sort of facets or receptivity in our own spiritual life so that when the virtue is obtained, it is kind of adorned and secured. So just to kind of play with the imagery, I'll kind of think in my mind, okay, that person has a lot of charity. So it's like they're adorned with rubies, right? Or that person has a lot of fortitude, and I always think of that as like a sapphire, and with hope as an emerald. And it's something that I kind of play with on my own. But it reminds me, right, that people possess virtues. And I'm sure that, right, we can point to certain people to say, oh, that person has charity, or that person has hope, or that person has fortitude, or that person has faith. And it's kind of like, just like you would have that person has certain jewelry or clothing, so too they possess virtues that they are wearing. Now, the definition of a virtue, all right, by its very, very etymology, it's talking about the middle way. And this is what's so important when studying the virtues, is every single virtue is dead center, and then on either side there's an excess and a deficiency. And Thomas Aquinas does a marvelous job articulating this. So here's an example of what Thomas does. He articulates, right, the virtue of hope. And then he says, okay, so what does it look like if you have too much hope? It's called presumption. It's a vice. What happens if you do not have enough hope? It's called despair. And then another one, right? As far as the virtues in the middle way, you have the virtue of fortitude or courage. What happens if you have too much fortitude or courage? It moves to rashness. What happens if you don't have enough fortitude or courage? It moves over to cowardice. And so we don't want to be rash. We don't want to be cowardice. We don't want to be presumptuous. We don't want to be despairing. We want to be hope-filled and courage-filled. And so virtues will always be in the middle. And this is why they're oftentimes very hard to obtain, is because we're kind of trying to always find the balance of what's too much and what's too little. Just to kind of show that virtue of courage, right? Is it's oftentimes thought like, okay, what is courageous is always speaking boldly about your faith. No matter what happens to you, you have to speak boldly. Well, prudence, which is the virtue that is like the highest of all virtues, says, you know what, in this instance, it's not actually very courageous to do it. It's actually rash. And you're going to crush the bruised reed, and you're going to quench the smoldering wick. And so that virtues show us the middle way. Now, an analogy that's oftentimes been used in the study of the virtues is a tree. And this comes actually from our tradition, Psalm number 1, the tree growing by running streams. So now a tree, if you've ever grown a tree just from a sapling, right? What inevitably happens is you plant the tree and you plant it vertically, but over time, just the ground settles and the roots move and the winds blow. And sometimes the tree can kind of like lean to one direction or the other. And then what you have to do is you have to take ropes, tie it around the tree, hold it taut in the opposite direction that it's pulling. And then eventually over time, the tree starts to right itself. And you keep tightening, right, the string so that it gets the tree to the right place, and then boom, it's straight again. And then it can continue to grow upright. We've all done like nature walks, right, where you see trees growing at all sorts of angles. The strongest trees that grow the longest and are the oldest are the ones that are the most vertical. So you can see why this imagery is used for the life of virtues, right? If we're kind of leaning one side or the other, either the deficiency or the excess, sure, it might seem good at first, but as it grows along, it's not going to be strong and stable and sturdy. And so the same thing is true actually in the obtaining of virtues, right? What might seem rash to one person might actually be virtuous for the one that is cowardice. Because if they're all the way on the other spectrum of cowardice, they're going to have to seem in their own mind a little more rash in order to get to the middle way, which is courage. And this is why each person's pursuit of virtue is going to look a little bit different in their spiritual life. And so it's important just to kind of always evaluate, is this too much? Is this too little? Trying to narrow in on that middle way. Now, the whole reason why one is going after virtues is it gives what our tradition calls a freedom of excellence. Now, I love this terminology because, it sounds cool, right? I want a freedom of excellence. I want to be excellent. But actually, when you look at the tradition, freedom of excellence is incredible, all right? Now, I love music, personally. I can't play any instrument. And I'm just a hack with my voice. I just kind of can hear something. Sometimes I can get the right note, sometimes not. I feel bad for all the music directors that have worked with me and have tried to help me get on key and on tune for things. But I'm just a hack at it. I'm not free. So let's say I've got this tune going on in my mind. I can't go to the piano and just pump it out, right? Or I can't just kind of invoke it with my voice and start singing this beautiful harmony. I'm not free. And the same thing is true even with a language, right? I don't know any other language other than sign language. If you've wondered why I've talked with my hands, it's because of my knowledge of sign language. But I don't know Spanish. I don't know French. I don't know Italian. Just a little bit of each. And so I'm a hack. So if I want to talk to someone in those languages, I'm not free to do so. What the virtues do is they allow us as a human being to be free to engage whatever is before us and not to actually be swayed by one thing or the other. So here's a couple examples of what this would look like, okay? So let's say that I lack that virtue of prudence, all right? I'm actually not free to speak my mind whenever I want to. Because I don't know when is the right time to speak and when the right time to be silent is, I'm always going to kind of be off. I'm going to say the wrong thing awkwardly, or I'm not going to speak up when I need to. So possessing the virtue of prudence will allow me to be free to know when I should speak and when I shouldn't. Another example of this, and maybe this is more tangible, right, is the virtue of temperance. If you possess the virtue of temperance, which tells you how much or how little of a substance, right, whether that's sleep, food, sex, drink, even exercise, everything is a temperance of how much of the passions to engage. If I don't possess temperance, let's say that I'm invited to this banquet, right? And I'm just starving, I'm famished, I haven't eaten yet the day. And I see this huge banquet table with food spread all over it. And then I see all the people in between me and the food. And I know I've got to say like, hello, thanks for having me here. How have you been doing? I haven't seen you for a while. If I don't possess temperance, I'm going to ignore everyone else at the party, just beeline for the food, load up my plate, start hoarding food into my mouth, then feel sick and lethargic and not talk to anyone. So again, you see the freedom of excellence, right? If I didn't possess temperance, I'm not free to go to a banquet and actually engage with people. I'm totally controlled by my passions. And for someone who's struggled with like alcoholism or some other addiction, they understand that, right? Is they're not free to go into normal social circumstances without being swayed by their passions. So the virtue of temperance actually keeps us right in the middle way, so we're free to be excellent in all of our interactions. We obtain virtues, though, by trial and error. And so this is where it's important actually to have role models in our life, is people that we respect and to say, you know what, okay, what would so-and-so do in this circumstance? By actually seeing concretely before us examples of virtue, we are actually able to say, okay, no, that would not happen that way if I was virtuous. So I'm going to emulate them even though I don't feel it internally. This is where, like, you know, that there's a Protestant kind of epitaph that came forward, WWJD, what would Jesus do? It's actually quite beautiful in the fact that you're thinking to yourself, okay, what would Jesus do during this time? Essentially saying, what would the role model? How should I behave in virtue? And then we conform what we're supposed to do, our actions, to some role model that we have. And it could be across the board. Maybe it's a politician, maybe it's a grandparent that we have, or even a parent, a teacher that we've had, a doctor, someone that's inspired us in our life, maybe a priest. And we think to ourselves, how would they behave in that instance? And then we emulate them, obtaining the virtue. Now, this is where in our tradition, the lives of the saints are incredibly important, and why the church always wants us to get familiar with the saints. Because as we study the lives of the saints, we get to see how did they live their lives of virtue, and what would it look like if I were to do the same. So for example, right, you have St. John Paul II, unbelievable saint. He grew up in Poland during the communist regime, horribly persecuted, lost his mother, lost his father, was working in salt mines, all right, entered the underground seminary, did his studies by night while he worked by day. He was constantly working with the youth, bringing them, encouraging them, working with young families, and he just persevered. And because of John Paul II, a lot of people actually attribute the fall of communism in Poland because of him. and his leadership and his witness, and of course his prayers. And so John Paul II is, like, in my mind, the definition of courage. And in fact, isn't this what he said in his pontificate? Be not afraid. And the reason why he could say, be not afraid, is he possessed that virtue of courage. So as we study the life of John Paul II, we're like, or Walter Chiswick, or some of these incredible saints that were persecuted for their faith, we see what an example of courage is, and it's like, okay, that's what I want to do in my life too. Or you have Mother Teresa, right, who formed the Missionaries of Charity, and she is the example and the model of charity. The story of Mother Teresa is one of my favorites. She had an appointment with John Paul II to see the Pope. And as they were making their way in Rome to see the Pope, she saw this person on the side of the street who was suffering greatly and was dying, actively dying. And she told the car to stop, despite him protesting, saying, no, we have to go to the Holy Father, we have to meet him. She got out of the car and was with the person, and the person died on the streets, held in Mother Teresa's arms. And John Paul II was stood up by Mother Teresa. And so you just see, right, is Mother Teresa, you're like, oh my gosh, I would never miss a meeting with the Pope. But what Mother Teresa's example shows us is actually charity beckoned me to be with this person more than the Holy Father. So the witnesses of the saints are incredibly inspiring. If you've never read a saint biography, I just encourage you, please do read some. They really do change how we view the life of sanctity and the life of virtues. Now, it's actually really interesting because if we study the development of religious life within the church, the first years of formation for religious was always centered around the lives of the saints. Because what they understood is, as these young people are getting formed in their vocation, they're not going to know what their vocation looks like unless they have examples to lead them. So usually the entire first year was all dedicated to reading the lives of the saints, so that they could kind of get in their minds this idea of what I could be like as a religious, and then it would kind of mark the rest of their formation. The virtues that I want to touch on first, right? There's a ton of different virtues, are what's called the cardinal virtues. Cardinal, right? Not like the bird or the Pope's friends, but cardinal in the fact of the etymology of cardinal to mean hinge. And so the cardinal virtues are actually temperance, fortitude, justice, and prudence. And on these four virtues, all the rest of the virtues and the spiritual life and the human ordered life to excellence actually hinge. If you possess fortitude, temperance, prudence, and justice, you will actually be able to be a truly free and excellent human being. Now, interestingly enough, these virtues are not distinctly Christian. They actually find their origins in pagan traditions. Within the pagan tradition, there was something called Stoicism. And we actually kind of still use vestiges of this word when we say to someone, oh, you're so stoic, which means you're not showing much passions or emotions. Because for the ancient pagans, possessing the virtues was like the most important thing ever. This was essentially their religion, was to possess as many virtues as you could. So the Stoicism, the Stoics would possess virtues and would allow their passions and emotions to be completely pushed down so that all of their decisions could be based upon right reason. Now, obviously, this denies a very important human part of us as human beings, right, is our emotions. They're not bad. They inform us. But what the pagans did see is if the virtues begin to control our behaviors, we are not free. Whereas when we possess a virtue, we're more free to determine what we do based on not the passions, but on right reason. No one in ancient Greece would have been confused by what a virtue was or what a virtue wasn't. They knew all of them, right? So if I were to say to an ancient Greek, tell me about justice, they could give me a definition. Tell me about prudence, they could give me a definition. Tell me about justice, no problem, they could give me a definition. However, I think to our modern ears, a lot of times we're confused at what these virtues look like. We could maybe give a definition of like the justice system, right? Or what a prudent decision is, but we'd have a hard time navigating what is the excess and deficiency of a virtue so that we know exactly what the middle way is. I will never forget, I was teaching in a classroom in a Catholic school, and I was asking the kids about justice, because underneath justice is the virtue of religion, right? And I just said, okay, can someone give me a definition of justice? And none of the kids could. And this was a 5th grade class. And I was saying, okay, so here's an example, right? If I give you $5, how much do you owe me? And the kids kind of paused, and I'm like, it's not a trick question. Like, literally, how much do you owe me? And I said, okay, I'm going to give you the answer. It's $5. If I give you $5, you owe me $5 back. I'm not charging interest, all right? This is what justice is. And so then I would, go into the virtue of religion, which is, okay, here's what God has given us. What does he ask in return? And it was the foundation for the religion, for the understanding of why do we go to Mass on Sundays, right? This is what God has asked of us. And even if we get nothing out of it, if the music's terrible, homily is lame, we don't like the people, the church is ugly, I want to sleep in, I'm exhausted, it doesn't matter. Because in justice, it's not about what I get out of it. It's the fact that God has asked this, and I'm responding to give back to him who has given me so much. But see, the knowledge of the virtues helps us to actually navigate more effectively that very difficult debate that comes to us about, do I have to go to church on Sundays or not? Now, as we start to go into the foundations of the virtues, we have to hit on something that St. Thomas Aquinas said. Now, Thomas Aquinas, if you want to do some research on like the virtue in the middle and then the excess and the deficiency, he maps it out absolutely marvelously. He goes through every single virtue and gives examples and stuff like this. It's phenomenal. You can find it all online for free. But Thomas Aquinas had this adage that he would go back to over and over again. He would say, grace builds upon nature. Or another way to say it is grace perfects nature. And what Thomas Aquinas was big on is if the natural elements of the human person are not ordered, it's going to be hard for God's grace to work. So just like those facets holding the jewels, right? We need to have the natural component. And so Thomas Aquinas loved talking about the virtues because it really helped people reflect, like, I have to get my natural life in order before I can expect God to do great things. This is also where, when we look at the lives of the saints possessed natural virtues, and because of it, supernatural things happened. Whereas what you won't see, right, is the saint that had no natural virtues was completely oblivious to the things of working in this world, but was filled with spiritual graces. God loves to use the ordinary means to do extraordinary things. Therefore, the possessing of virtues is the best way to ensure that we do not forfeit or miss on any of God's grace. Now, one of the images that's used by Garrigou-Lagrange, and he takes a lot of Thomas Aquinas' writings and writes in the spiritual life, is the virtues work like if you're in a boat and you're rowing oars, right? If you've ever, you go into a rowing machine, you're like, oh, this is easy. I'm just sitting and going back and forth, back and forth. Yeah, do that for 25 minutes, all right? Your arms are exhausted, your back is exhausted, you're winded, all right? Your legs are tired. It's not easy. But the more that you get into the action of rowing, you start to get into a pattern where it becomes easier. And so Garrigou-Lagrange uses this imagery of how the virtues work. The virtues are like oars working with the human person, and I can go twice as far in the water when I actually know how to use the oars correctly. The same thing is true with the life of virtue. As I possess certain virtues, I can actually go farther in the spiritual life than I could on my own. Now, Father Reverend Charles Doyle, he wrote a book called Spiritual Direction. And I think it's out of print now. It's exceptional if you're trying to learn about what is spiritual direction or even how do I do spiritual direction. In it, he gives eight things that one must do in order to increase virtue. And so I'm going to read through these. Sorry, I don't have a teleprompter, so I'm going to take my eyes off the screen. So Charles Doyle says this. Number 1, develop a fundamental knowledge of the virtue. This is what we've been talking about. You cannot obtain what you do not know. Second, desire and love the virtue that you wish to possess. So as we start to see them as attractive, we actually want to move towards them, right? Just like if you're a kid and you see something in one of the windows when you're walking by a shop, you're willing to do anything to get that, to fundraise, to have a lemonade stand, to beg your parents day in and day out, can I please have this, to wait for your birthday or for Christmas or something like this. If it looks attractive, I'm going to want it. Number 3, we must want to become perfect. Now, if we really see the virtues as something that we have to become perfected in, it's hard not to desire them. Number 4, pray for the grace that nothing would inhibit your possession of the virtue. Because again, right, God is going to bless this. And so if we can just say, Lord, I want you to bless my pursuit of chastity or fortitude or prudence, the Lord is going to start to infuse us with the grace and the ability to overcome vice to obtain the virtue. Number 5, place concern on actually practicing the virtue. Now, St. Ignatius of Loyola had this marvelous way of doing this. He actually would write the virtue down on a piece of paper and he would make tally marks next to it. So every single night when he would do his examination of conscience, he would actually see how many times did I actually engage the virtue of, let's say, patience. And he would look at his thing and say, okay, I did it 6 times today. I did it 4 times yesterday. And so my goal is going to be to exercise patience 8 times today. So it's a concrete way to actually see how can I grow in the virtue. Number 6, resolve to examine your conscience to see if you are lacking a particular virtue. And again, this is where we can just literally ask the Holy Spirit, what am I missing? What virtue would you like me to possess so that I can be more free and excellent? And there's no doubt, right? Again, God wants us to become free. This is John 10:10. I came that you may have life and have it to the full. And so as we start to engage that examination of conscience, we can actually say, Lord, what do you want me to have? This goes back to when we were talking about the spiritual tradition in the illuminative phase, literally turning on the lights to see what I have and what I don't have, that aha moment. Then number 7, resolve to follow direction and guidance of another. Again, you're watching the example of someone else and saying, I want to become just like that person, versus I'm just going to form myself into myself, which doesn't change us at all. And then number 8, concentrate on one virtue at a time. Now, this might be the most important. What the enemy likes to do is to show a ton of shiny objects all at once, and we're like, okay, I want this, and I want this, and I want this, and we make no progress because we're spread so thin. As hard as it might be just to hone in on one virtue to say, okay, for this month, this week, this year, I'm going to just work on the virtue of prudence. All my prayer is going to be about prudence. All my examination is going to be about prudence. All my reading is going to be about prudence, so that when I get to the end of the year, I've actually stored up on that one virtue. Now, from this point forward, I am going to move all towards the cardinal virtues again. And so the first one that we have to start off with is called the virtue of prudence, which actually governs all the rest of the virtues. Without prudence, we actually don't know what temperance, justice, and fortitude actually look like. And so for the next video, we will present on what is prudence.